So this video I put to a vote some time ago on Twitter. Overwhelmingly, people wanted to see this video, so here we are. But if I'm going to be your dancing monkey, you should at least like the video and support the channel through my Ko-fi so I can acquire a desk and a microphone so I can get some real sound quality in here, so go click those. I wish I could find a reason that I could contribute to some sort of de-radicalization blueprint. I've stewed and stewed on this until my puzzle was sore, and I can't find an answer. Nothing that sticks out to me as an X factor. So, much like Sean and Dusty before me, I can only share my story and share my views of the issues from my unique perspective. Obviously, I start this journey with a lot more handicaps than those two individuals. I'm not a straight cishet white guy. That automatically grants me some armor from the kind of cultural infiltration the alt-right trades in. But I also started out a lot deeper than either of them, or indeed most who affiliate with red pill ideology. And certainly having those barriers isn't a guarantee, as there are people like Iron Liz who were still proud Gamergaters as late as 2017. I'll also just say, I'm going to sound like I toot my own horn in this video. That is just how it's going to sound, even though I am just relaying certain relevant details of my life. My resume, for lack of a better word, on knowing proto-alt-right culture is important, and it's important I express to you how I got there. And I've decided if I am modest about the details, it might harm the argument I'm trying to make, so I'm just going to be blunt. Without being identifying if I can, I might fail at that last bit. People associate me with the online left. I don't bother correcting them unless they're slinging it like a gotcha, but I've always been a self-identified conservative, though a lot of my life I've always just been dissatisfied with status quo. In middle school, I used to argue the benefits of authoritarian communism with my geography teacher, partly for laughs, partly because I disliked that a certain state or people were good because my textbook said it was good. It was the 90s, post-Cold War, and we were smug on our own farts that democracy had already won. I remember him mostly rolling his eyes at me, but he did tell my parents, apparently, that I should have been in high school at the time, so I guess he saw something of worth in my insights, even if only my analytical skill. Sometime in mid-high school, I had finally decided I wanted to be in radio. Talk radio was at its peak in the late 90s and the early noughties, so I had plenty of inspiration to draw from. My heroes, for my projected career path, were Orson Welles, the legend, the comedy genius Phil Hendry, and, of course, on the talk radio side, Jerry Doyle. I wouldn't have done a Rush Limbaugh-style show, even if I do respect Rush's chops on the mic, though Rush is a pale comparison to Michael Savage, by far the superior entertainer, and also the most crazy at the time, though these days he would just be Tucker Carlson, with talent. And I listened to a lot more than that. I sampled all kinds of shows. There used to be a great online talk radio gallery where you could listen to any station with an online presence and find a station playing any given show at any given time. Did you miss Rush That Afternoon? Don't worry, California has a station that plays them at 6 p.m. I could have told you everyone who had a talk show, both serious politics like Tony Snow, or something much more bro culture like Don Imus. I had listened to them, mostly for technical skill observation, at some point before I turned 20. I didn't exactly have a plan, but I knew I wanted to do something in the middle of those three icons of mine. I used to make radio plays, back when I was good at voices. Something about Geraldo Rivera gunning down terrorists after all the press had been drafted into the military by George Bush. You know, dumb kid stuff that gets a few laughs from adults. In the age before Robot Chicken made that a pretty common thing. But my political interest stayed sharp. My senior year in high school, I was in an AP Government and Politics class. My U.S. history teacher, the junior-level social studies course, had signed off on a recommendation for it. He probably shouldn't have, by all the policies of my school, where homework and the completion of it was worth about 50% of your grade across the board, even in gym and band class. The only reason I graduated was because I aced every test and managed to turn in a couple assignments just to keep above water throughout school. To that end, I didn't find out till the end of my senior year that the administration had tried to remove me from the AP Government class, but my teacher had, so my principal told me, fought to keep me in, even if I was taking up a spot someone else could have filled. I never got to ask her about that. It was a pretty good year to be in that class as well, as this was a presidential election year, and we got to learn the process side by side. Again, I'm not saying this to say, look how much smarter I am, or was, but just to say I really have cared about these issues for a very long time. Longer than someone my age is expected to have. I know the name Alan Greenspan quite well from his prominence, basically as the most powerful man in America on the nightly news before the 9/11 attacks pushed that aside. I remember those political shifts, even if I was only a teenager. I was friends with similarly rebellious conservative individuals, one of whom is still my best friend today, whom we jokingly refer to as the Nazi, what with his right-wing views and blue eyes and blonde hair. It was a lot of low-level shitlording in between actual discussions of history and politics in the cafeteria. I do still hold those values, conservative values, today. I prize duty, order, having a state. I think these are positive things. I'll at least never be an anarchist. And I also value having principles, which is how I differentiate myself from the modern Republican Party. The postmodern conservatives are weak-willed little shits who need to take their ball away. But the thing is, the Republicans used to feel that way too. In 2007, I had been kicked out of college for being trans. Long story. But I couldn't lawyer up, and so it was what it was. In this period of my parents not letting me go home and not having a place to stay, I found myself in the service of a congressional campaign just getting off the ground. It was a no-shot campaign, without even a primary challenger. The incumbent had been serving for several terms, and the campaign I was serving was a Republican challenger to a, historically, deep blue seat. But deep blue in that FDR, blue-collar sort of way. Still, with congressional re-election at 97% and no significant chinks in the armor, the candidate was mostly running as a joke. More on the principle of the matter that there should be real contrasting opinion. He was a retiree with some local notoriety. But what also meant was that because we weren't a nationally contested seat, no one would be investing in the campaign. And that meant I got in deep. I was the campaign aide. That basically meant I ran the phones at the office, took calls for the candidate, ghost wrote letters and pitches, ghost answered a number of things while the candidate was out on the trail. I filled out FEC forms, back when McCain-Feingold was still a thing, something we probably should have had an accountant for, but I made do. Also, as the only person on staff most of the campaign under 25, I was the de facto IT person. Our campaign was the Proto-Tea Party. But wait, the Tea Party only existed in 2010, yet not officially, but it still existed before that. I particularly think of our campaign manager. A little bit crazy, and we are all pretty convinced he was in the CIA. For the purposes of this exercise, I'm going to call the campaign manager David, because he's probably the choice example of someone who fell the opposite way I did, even though in 2008 we were very much aligned on a lot of issues. State politics were complicated at the time. I presume they still are, as the state Republican Party was in a feudal period. They had been out of power for so long that the National Republican Party had basically stopped funding them altogether, mostly letting them do whatever. Our only real power came from the Republicans we managed to sneak into the Senate. Under those circumstances, the county offices were the real kingmakers, but that meant our little congressional campaign had no support. It was a mess. We had to communicate with the chairs of the county committees directly because there was no statewide organized effort to prop up federal candidates. That also meant I got to go to the state convention, of course, due to my relatively high position as handling so many juggling pins. It's the state convention, by the way, where you'll find that the most anti-abortion people are all women. Sure, men will be anti-choice as an aggregate, but they'll take it for granted. The people who can't shut up about it, the ones who will insert it into every conversation, who will Cato and Carthage must be destroyed the abortion issue, most of those people are women. The people who go there are the movers and the boots on the ground for your local politics. And you find a lot of weird quirks like this. And it was those people that David would mock to me in private conversations we had. In another congressional race in the state that was much more highly contested, there was a moderate Republican in the primary, a veteran, running against a Christian conservative. The moderate won, rather handily, but not before the Christian faction tried to hang the convention over it. David said to me one day These people are ruining the party. They aren't conservatives, they're Christian liberals. They want to change everything to suit their agenda regardless of principle. Reagan knew the best way to handle them was to keep them at the back of the bus, throw them a thumbs up now and then, and ignore them. Okay, so David wasn't exactly woke for a man born in the 40s, but the bluntness is what keeps it in my head to this day, I think. But I think his attitude is important here. When the general election comes around, and the moderate there lost, he told me, you know, there are still people who think the Christian candidate would have been better because he didn't compromise. Fucking idiots. His words, not mine. Our campaign also moved to secure the support of minorities, even though we had very few in our district. David said to me that the xenophobic wing of the Republican Party was dooming it to a short future. He articulated the rather mainstream position at the time that the Republicans needed the Latinos and needed them soon. They were socially conservative due to the heavy Catholic background. They were hardworking, diligent, and motivated. And importantly, they had children. This sounds cold and dehumanizing and reductive, but it's strategy, and most strategy is those things. There wasn't any threat by the data that whites were becoming a plurality in America, it was just a fact. The position of people like David was that you had to discern a position in that future, not cling to the past. And this was basically mainstream Republican thought prior to the racial backlash against Barack Obama. Many still clung to it in 2016, saying that Trump's goal of 70% white voter support was a pipe dream, doubling down on out-of-date strategies due to this demographic shift. And since we're using David as a case study here, I don't mean to suggest I agreed with him on everything, or that I just absorbed his mentorship. For example, he was one of those big fans of the Roman Republic and thought we should have a citizen militia, which frankly is a dumb idea. How many households can afford cruise missiles these days? Because if you want the Republican Army, that's what you need to do. But he was very ideologically consistent, at least, I suppose. I saw plenty of the proto-Tea Party stuff as well. There were local contests in the state Senate where people were arguing that Republicans, who in our state, remember, are the clear minority, who compromised with Democrats to push anything through the Senate, were traitors. They were there. They were always there, even before Obama. People who had internalized that appeasement is evil to such a degree, it now applied to domestic politics. I stepped away from a political career after that election, even though David had wanted to run me for the State House in 2010. I didn't quite feel like being an LGBT candidate on the Republican ticket at the time. But he did lay out a pretty impressive plan that he thought would work. I kept moving around the country after that, but I was still on that very classical liberal sphere of the web. For instance, I first learned about the Trayvon Martin story from the amazing atheist of all people, who called it a disgrace for white people everywhere. Wild, right? When a few years later Gamergate appeared. My roommate at the time was very into it. He wasn't rabid or even angry at anything. He was a mellow guy who just happened to listen to lots of Gamergate podcasts. But this is where our story comes full circle. See, myself and my friend who I referred to as the Nazi had listened to plenty of radio in our days. Among those shows was Coast to Coast AM, which for the uninitiated was the late 90s conspiracy talk show. They talked about lizard people, UFOs, prophetic dreams, all that kind of stuff. But they'd also mix in some tech stuff, you know, like the kind of stuff people with hand crank radios would be interested in as it developed. It wasn't entirely trash. Much like Steve Bannon's philosophy isn't all lies, there are cores of truth and information in there. One of my particular favorites was an interview with some guys who were touting their digital analysis oracle. Basically, the theory went, humans as a community had this sort of sixth sense about the near future and social anxieties. This leaked through in anxieties in their language and behavior, much like there are warning signs of a recession before the recession hits. Bond indexes falling the short term, for instance. So, for instance, we might be collectively aware of rising threats and vulnerabilities in security. And this program would study all of those blog posts and social media events and deduce that everyone knew we were due for a terrorist attack. They claimed to have analyzed the data around the turn of the millennium and predicted a terrorist attack in the summer of 2001. and then the explosion of the Columbia being off by a few weeks. So far, not bad. It's an intriguing idea at any rate, fun to explore. And I'll never forget when they came back from the break and they said, and this is how we prove the Illuminati exist. And my friend and I said, oh god damn it, well, I'll just throw away the last 15 minutes of our lives. Because Coast to Coast was the original 4chan. I didn't know anyone else besides the two of us who listened to it at all, let alone semi-regularly, by which I mean like 5 times a month. But we listened for fun. We didn't take the ideas seriously. We, as in the example above, openly laughed at a lot of it. Coast to Coast was often a target for Phil Hendry, who would put on a parody of his own making of the silliness of it, where the guest, General Johnson Jameson, would get drunk and get laid with Bigfoot. Lots of people pretending to be Phil Hendry characters, and maybe even Phil himself once or twice as those characters. Crank called the show mercilessly. But there was no punchline to the crank calls, no Baba Booey. Played straight in that ironic 4chan way. You could never be 100% sure if the people calling believed what they were saying. And this experience with the format, however, is what made me similarly write off Gamergate. It sounded like a coast-to-coast podcast, only it wasn't the Illuminati, it was feminism. As a general rule, if I can cut and paste your podcast and replace the subject with the words the Illuminati in place of your proper noun and not lose anything in the translation, I don't take your movement seriously. It has to not sound like Coast to Coast AM. But all of these Gamergate shows that my roommate was listening to, mostly as a hobby, again, not as a diehard gator, all sounded that way. I couldn't even tell them apart. He would have to correct me on which show he was listening to this week. On top of this, that period was one of the hardest in my life, so I had real shit to worry about. And eventually so did my roommate, so he stopped listening. And this is the primary reason myself and my friend, the Nazi, saw Gamergate for what it was. It was bunk. It was something to be mocked, not taken seriously as academic scholarship. The two of us ducked that swing. Other people around me, however, were probably unaware of it. And I think that was most important to me. I had my guard up heading into 2016, that my principles were my principles. But because I had seen Gamergate from the outside, I was also one of the few people who took Trump very seriously. Not that that's particularly insightful. Look at the last 3 Republican primaries. Whoever starts out in the lead has an easy shot at winning, because as the losers drop out, they never quite coalesce around opposition strong enough to displace the frontrunner. Huckabee couldn't displace McCain, who started with near 40%. He argued that people deserved opposition, but other contenders dropped out too late to let their votes back him up. Romney started the 2012 election in the same boat, a dominant 30-something%, and while most people voted for not Romney, no one dropped out early enough to make it matter. It wasn't exactly rocket science to see Trump open with that same 30-something% and see the exact same process repeat itself. I can even pinpoint you the moment that my party loyalty died, January 14th, 2016. During that GOP debate, Trump had made headlines with his Muslim ban. It was such an important question that every candidate on the stage took to answer. Some candidates disagreed with the specific Muslim ban, but all of them agreed that a pause in Syrian refugees would be a good thing. Everyone except one, and that was Jeb. Common sense, that we would have to create a Gestapo, that you couldn't let refugees die, was met with uncomfortable silence. It was almost Shakespearean in how he had to look around the stage, hoping someone would back him up, and no one would. And this brings us back to David, who started the campaign in 2015 as very dismissive of Trump. You might have even designated him as a never-Trumper. But as the election drew nearer and the field narrowed until he ultimately won, David became another postmodern conservative. Winning mattered more than the integrity of institutions, in the end. And this brings us to the moral of the story, which I guess is take solace that I simply dodged Gamergate because I had seen its pattern 10 years early. And maybe in another 5 years, the veterans of Gamergate will also see the silliness. But I also think my friend, the Nazi, and I were able to save each other. We were able to act as grounding for each other, to look at the insane shit happening around the Trump campaign and say, am I seeing what I think I'm seeing? And I can tell you when Gamergate became personal to me, the sad puppies, prior to them appearing, I still looked at Gamergate rather neutrally. Much like Yahtzee does, I think. Not really supporting them, not really caring that they were just kids doing stupid shit. I still looked at them through that lens of conspiracy radio. But when they ruined the Hugo Awards, demolished the institution, I took that very personally. And I became fixed to the anti-Gamergate crowd, and ultimately Antifa. Mind, I didn't really experience Gamergate. I'm not a particularly invested gamer, and I'd outgrown 4chan long before it started. Most of my knowledge comes from the outside, from those who documented it as it happened and seeing its aftermath. And that's perhaps not a particularly motivating note, that we need to wait for the alt-right to destroy something precious to turn people against it. But I do think it's a useful tool for coalition building. We don't need everyone to be Antifa, but we do need more than just debunking about how terrible they are in order to construct a society where the alt-right can be continually marginalized and pushed out of power.